Well, friends, we're going to go ahead and begin. I don't think I need a microphone, although Carlos is going to have one. Carlos Ham, obviously, the Matanzas Seminary, their president of it. And it's a joy for him to be with us. He traveled from Havana to Miami and then up to Nashville Friday night. He's been spending time with me, and I'm sorry, my name's Mark Mueller. I'm the executive director at the Outreach Foundation, and he'll speak at our board meeting tomorrow, right in this room, and then he flies out to various parts of the United States, Greenville, and then down to Tampa, as they're very involved with living waters for the world. Probably 64 of their churches have actual living waters for the world wells. And that is a huge community resource. And he'll talk about that. As I was there, people bringing water jugs to get clean water is a huge ministry for all of the churches. So Carlos, again, we welcome you. He kind of hints at it in his sermon. I hope he's able to talk to you about the devastating effects of sanctions on Cuba and what life is like. I mean, this is really obviously a communist country. You know, it's a less than an hour flight from Miami, very, very close. But it is in my estimation, almost a third world country in terms of the ability to gain some kind of food to live on. Everything is of such critical need right now. The sanctions, and again, I'm not saying one way or another about sanctions. I'm just saying what sanctions have done. They've had a huge decrease in the ability to raise crops because sanctions prevent fertilizer from being sent, and sanctions prevent pesticides from being sent. And so the ability to produce like black beans has been dramatically decreased. The ability to find rice now becomes huge. These people are living on, if it's available, chicken. So he will tell you a story, I think, of there being a worship service, and then somebody announces that chicken is available for you to buy, and the congregation has to decide if they're going to stay for communion or go and get chicken. You know, it's about trying to find food. Carlos, again, I don't want to steal your thunder. You've got plenty of stories. He has a short video produced by the Presbyterian Foundation. Tom Taylor, if you know Tom, did some great work down there. And we would like this to be kind of interactive. If you've got some questions, just pop them up. He's a wonderful man. And he's considered a friend of ours and our family now, as I took
family member,
as I took him in, picked him up and eventually didn't take him through the front door, but took him through the garage. So that makes you a fan. Carlos?
I'm going to give you the camera.
Okay,
Thank you. Good morning. And how much time do we have? When are we supposed to finish? What time? 11, so 10 till. Okay, so about here's the boss. Here's the boss. 10:40. 10:40. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Well, good morning, and thank you again for the invitation to be here with you. I have been to the States many times. In fact, I grew up here in the States because my mother was a missionary from West Virginia. But it's the first time I come to Nashville. So we had a wonderful time yesterday in the baseball game in the stadium, no? With all the instructions of the pastor, who is an expert not only in theology, but also in baseball. And another thing that I learned, I thought I knew a lot of English, but one of the things that I learned when I got my coffee, my sister, she asked, do you want leaded coffee or unleaded coffee? I thought that was only applied to gasoline, but also to coffee as well, no? it wasn't that bad. It wasn't like Cuban coffee, but it wasn't that bad. So it was, but no, thank you, thank you. Okay, so thank you, Mark, for the introduction. So we're going to start with this video, which was made just before the COVID pandemic. Tom Taylor, the executive director of the Presbyterian Foundation, came down to our country to do a video with fundraising purposes. And the good thing about it is that it relates both to the church and also to the seminary. Our seminary is ecumenical. Our theological seminary is ecumenical. That means that we have several churches involved in our board and in our faculty. But we work very closely also with the congregations, with the churches and the Presbyterian Church as well. So Tom here makes a very good job in doing some historical introduction, historical background. And then after we watch the video, I'm going to add a couple of things, and then we'll be open, rather than teaching a class or saying a lecture, rather we're going to engage in a dialogue. So, and thank you. I'm trying to remember your name. Alec, thank you for helping us with technology.
For many of us, the name Cuba evokes thoughts of the Communist Revolution in 1959 or the missile crisis under President John F. Kennedy. Others may think of the glamour days when the rich and famous vacationed here enjoying the culture, the sun, the music, and the cigars that this island is famous for. But what few may know is the Presbyterian Church has had a deep and enduring presence here for more than 120 years, even during all the years of the Revolution. And these Presbyterian congregations here today are thriving.
During the first 30 years of the revolution, it was quite difficult for the churches to carry out their mission. There was a subtle type of discrimination against the different Christians. That was my own experience. I was 2 years old when the revolution triumphed. My father was a Cuban pastor, my mother was an American missionary. And we were raised in that, let's say, atheist environment.
Yo nací en una familia revolucionaria, comunista, atea, donde hablar de Dios no era algo concebido. Yo no conocía nada ni de la Biblia, ni de Jesucristo, nunca había escuchado nada que tuviera que ver con una iglesia. Pero con 15 años, los amiguitos del barrio comenzaron a visitar la iglesia presbiteriana. Entonces me invitan y yo fui a un estudio bíblico en Navidad. Me presentaron a un hombre que yo no conocía, que se llamaba Jesús. Así conocía al Señor y esos fueron mis primeros pasos dentro de la iglesia.
We understand that people are very much thirsty here in Cuba, and they want to learn more about the Bible, about God, about spirituality. People, they look for these opportunities to start reading the Bible and participating in the Bible studies in the houses and even going to church as well. So there is a huge movement of the Spirit throughout the island in terms of people getting more and more, gaining more and more interest in the spiritual things.
The Evangelical Theological Seminary of Matanzas, Cuba is at the center of church life. For over 70 years, the seminary has trained pastors and other church leaders for the many very active congregations on the island.
The philosophy of our seminary is the integration of theory and practice, which means that from Monday to Friday, they receive the theoretical academic classes per se, and also over the weekends, the churches send them to the different local parishes.
Soñamos con que esta escuela sea una escuela que, sobre todo, que responda a las necesidades de la iglesia cubana. Pastores con ministros bien preparados, pero sobre todo insertados, muy bien insertados en la realidad cubana y el contexto cubano.
If you can imagine, about 80% of those attending Presbyterian churches in Cuba are brand new believers. And the faith is growing fastest among teenagers and young adults, many of whom have already expressed a clear interest in church leadership as pastors, youth leaders, musicians, and in other roles.
Y hay una frase muy popular en Cuba que dice que la juventud está perdida. Pero yo tengo mucha esperanza en Dios y pienso que los jóvenes no solo somos el futuro, sino también somos el presente.
Y ha sido una experiencia muy linda de renovación, de entrega, de servicio, de vocación, de sentir que puedo hacer mucho más por la iglesia.
No solo el pastoral y su asignatura, ¿no? Con su excelente trabajo en hacerme repensar en mi fe, sino también el trabajo en la iglesia local. Me hicieron ver más allá de lo que yo quería o pensaba que podía ser. Y es así como yo acá.
Y pienso que si la iglesia de los primeros siglos, los padres de la iglesia tuvieron esperanza de que la iglesia, de ser reprimida, pasara a una iglesia abierta y que estuviera en todo el mundo y en todas las naciones, pienso que nosotros tenemos esperanza y fe en el Señor de que la juventud va a seguir estando ahí, va a seguir trabajando y sirviendo para la gloria de Dios y para la iglesia.
The churches in the 1990s, at the beginning of the new millennium, started to grow tremendously. And as a direct result, we started to have a new influx of students in our seminary. To the extent that, for example, we were only 4 students that graduated in the seminary, and now we have around 500 students in our different programs.
This kind of growth is incredibly exciting, but it's also very challenging because it creates the need for new, well-trained church leadership, as well as the construction and upkeep of church facilities, many of which are used almost every day for these rapidly growing congregations and the communities that they serve.
The Cuban Church and the Presbyterian Church USA have been in partnership for many, many years.
That's right.
When relationships broke with the governments, that partnership was also tenuous. But the churches continued to seek fellowship and understanding, even through those very difficult times.
The Cubans often say that by having these relationships, they realize they're not alone, even though they may have been isolated through some of these years. The connection through the church is what's been constant.
This work in the seminary is a joyful and hopeful work. No? It helps us to see with optimism even when things are not so clear and things are not so certain. It is an opportunity always to be certain that even when we don't know what the future holds, we know who holds the future.
There is a church in Cuba. It's a faithful church. It's a working church. It's a church serving the community. It's a church that have been in trouble in the past, and they survive, and they will be faithful to their faith and trying to model to the Cuban country what it means to be the kingdom of God in the middle of this history.
If you or your church would like to get involved, partnering with this beautifully fertile place of Christian mission, and join in the amazing work that God is doing in Cuba, please contact us today. And thank you for your faithfulness.
Thank you. So, is everybody awake? Yes? So a bit to summarize, no? 1959 was the triumph of the revolution. The atheist or communist character of the revolution was declared around the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Some of those that have gray hair or less hair may remember. And then just after that came the missile crisis. At that time, we were living in the States. My father was studying theology in in Europe, and then we returned to Cuba during the missile crisis. But 1 year before, 1961, Fidel Castro declared the communist character of the revolution. It became much more radical. We shifted our, let's say, social political engagement towards Moscow. And one of the problems of the Marxist-Leninist philosophy that we inherited was a highly atheist one. That meant that in Cuba, no churches were closed, as it happened in Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union. Some priests and pastors were persecuted. They were put into jail just because they were clergy, they were ordained. That was, thank God, that was never the case in Cuba. As I mentioned, we had a more subtle type of discrimination by which a Christian could not study, a young Christian could not study a career that would have impact in the ideology of the people. That means we could not study journalism, foreign affairs, psychology. We have a member of our faculty that has a good sense of humor. He became an agronomic engineer. You say agronomic engineer? Agricultural engineer? No, but working also with animals. Well, anyway, he said, they allowed me to study this career because it's not possible to evangelize cows. No? So at that time, of course, most of the pastors of our church left the country. 70% of the pastors, they came to the States. 80% of the graduates of the seminary who we are serving now, 80, came to the States. They said Christ left the country, and therefore we have to go as well. No, but the interesting thing is that Christ came to the U.S. No, so the pastors came to the U.S. And at that time, my father, who had some offers to work either in Europe or in the States, he said, now it's the time to go to Cuba, because they say that Christ left Cuba. Well, left Cuba. Let's go back and bring him back. No, so we grew up in this atheist environment. Not so easy, being this son of a pastor and of a American missionary, on top of being American missionary. But we always remain faithful to the church. And I say it not as my own personal merit. I think it's the Spirit really led us towards this faithfulness. So no church were closed, but we could not carry out any Christian mission beyond the four walls of the sanctuary. So when I studied in the seminary in the 1980s, we were only 4 students, and we studied to serve in a type of church which was confined to the 4 walls of the sanctuary. According to the Marxist, Leninist teaching, the church was going to disappear. We're not going to close any church, but it's going to disappear by its own. It's going to fall by its own weight, because as far as we, the Marxist revolution, are able to satisfy the basic needs of the Cuban people, there's no need for churches. So at that time, I was studying in the army. I was serving in the army, and they sent me to a special army because I was a religious person. And I can tell you more about that. But when I ended the army, after 3 years, my pastor called me. And he said, Carlos, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, no, I would like to become an energy engineer. And I actually got the registration. I registered And he said, why don't you consider going to the seminary? So I really felt that God was calling me to go to the seminary. God was calling me to my pastoral vocation. At that time, who was my girlfriend, she said, no way, don't count on me, because there's no point in studying a career that doesn't have any future, no? So I finally convinced her, and then I had to convince her parents as well. But I went to the seminary, and at that time we were only 4 students. One of them became the Methodist Bishop of Angola. So we have had also students and professors from other countries as well. So after the Berlin Wall collapsed, there is a 180 degrees shift of the relationships between the state and the church. That meant that no longer Christians were discriminated because of our faith. Not only Christians, but people of other faith, as religious faith as well. So as a result of that, of a more open policy towards religion, number one. And number two, as a result of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union and the communist East European Communist bloc, we went through a very, very critical economic situation, very critical economic situation, which, because of these 2 factors, shortages of all types of things on the one hand, and a more open policy of the state towards the churches got completely packed, full of people, full of people. I was serving as a pastor in Havana at that time, and our sanctuary was completely full of people. And as a direct result of that, we had a new influx of students in our seminary, no? So as I said in the video, we moved from having 4 students during my time, early 80s, up until 500 students, and a huge growth. So that means that one of the reasons why the churches were packed, fully packed of people. I remember I used to work with the World Council of Churches in Geneva, in Switzerland. And we received the visit of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Anglican bishop from South Africa. He came to visit us, and he said something that I have never forgotten. He said, the faith, the gospel of Jesus Christ is more meaningful for those whose life is rough, Those are having a hard time really to survive. And that was precisely what happened in Cuba, no? Many people started to come to the church with a tremendous need of spirituality, of meaning for their lives. And I'm very proud, no, that the churches and the gospel of Jesus Christ helped to provide meaning to the lives of the people. So then after the 1990s, we, in this new situation of the country, by which the churches are not only allowed, but are expected to serve the people in need, to carry out, as we say, to carry out diaconal projects. Diakonia, comes from a Greek word that means service. One of the biggest challenges of our seminary today is how can we form new pastors and new community organizers for a type of church that is serving the people out of the 4 walls of the sanctuary. As Leslie Newbigin said, this bishop from the UK, he served as a bishop in India, and also he served in the World Council of Churches, the World Commission on Evangelism and Mission. He said the church should not be an institution, but rather an expedition. I love that quote. Church should not be an institution. something that is inward looking, that is an end in itself, but rather an expedition, a church that is carrying out its mission out in the society, in the world, through different ways, through service, no? So that is one of the biggest changes that we have experienced in our seminary, to form pastors who are serving as community organizers, trying to help the people, not only from the spiritual or pastoral point of view, but also from the material point of view. So for this, we are very grateful for our partnerships. We have CPN, a Cuban Partnership Network, working with the Louisville office. You know, in Louisville, Kentucky is the headquarters of PCUSA, and there they have an office that relates, excuse me, to our churches. And this CPN, this network, gathers all the Presbyterian churches in the States that accompany us in a partnership with different churches in Cuba and with our seminary. And the Outreach Foundation is part also of that network. So we appreciate very much the accompaniment, the support that we receive, particularly financial support. But the situation in Cuba now is so extremely critical that even with the hard currency, the dollars that we receive, it's difficult to find food as a result of the US sanctions, but also as a result of shortcomings of our state, no? That sometimes the administration is not that efficient, and third place, because of the economic crisis globally, no, financial crisis as a result of the war in Ukraine, and also the result of the COVID pandemic. Signs of hope, and that's what I mentioned in my sermon today. No, for us, hope is the key word today. No, hope that we can continue struggling for a more just society. Hope that the sanctions and the embargo are lifted. Hope that in a new, there's a whole new process of organizing private companies that are very efficient, helping to reinvigorate our economy. All these are signs of hope that we have. And as I mentioned in the sermon, hope, a living hope. It's living because it's based in the glorious resurrection of Jesus. So, Mark, time for dialogue. Yes. Thank you. In more than 65 years of the revolution, we have had several migration waves, no? Several, at the beginning of the revolution, then in the 1980s, 1990s, after the so-called special period, etc. But we have never had so much people and good people leaving the country as now. I don't remember the figures, but I think it's about 300,000 people have left. And these are the best part of our society, no? The young people, highly trained, very energetic. We desperately need them to stay in the country in order for us to rebuild the country. And they're solving their own personal and family needs leaving the country, no? So now there's as we speak, there's a new program set by the government here, which is through a sponsorship. If there's a family in Cuba that finds a sponsor here, somebody that can prove enough financial possibilities, they sign the papers, and in a matter of days, short weeks, they come already to the States. And all that is precisely motivating this migration and this brain drain, as we also call it. So that's one of the sad parts of the situation that we are living today. And yes, I mean, many of the shelves, not only of the stores, but even more sadly, the shelves of the pharmacies are virtually empty. People dying because of lack of basic medicine, no? As a result, again, as I mentioned, of the sanctions, during the worst time of the COVID pandemic, we needed oxygen to literally save lives. And the US administration did not allow us to get oxygen from this country. Can you imagine? Not even in a humanitarian situation that we faced at that time, we were able to get oxygen just 90 miles away our country, no? So that's part of the situation that we are facing. So one of the things that the Cuban authorities are trying to do is for us to produce more food, to produce more medicines. We have a good pharmaceutical industry. The thing is that we have a lack of raw material, but we're in the process of getting raw materials again in order to produce more medicines. And now, as we speak, a critical, very critical situation is with the fuel for the gasoline and the diesel. So there are many cars that are parked because of lack of fuel. Also, another big problem we're facing is many blackouts because of lack of possibility of producing electricity, which affects a lot of people, not only because of cooling system and not only because of lights, but also because many families, they cook with electricity. So it is affecting also the nourishment of the people. Yes. Uh-huh. Thank you. Good question. It was with Obama that relationships between both countries started to open. For many, many decades, both embassies in both countries were closed, and it was Obama who reopened both embassies. And we started to get a lot of American tourists coming in. It's amazing how that helped our economy to get much more invigorated. It's interesting. Obama said in his speech in Cuba, in his main speech, he said, we have to lift the embargo because it's not working. We put it in place in order to punish the members of the Communist Party and of the government, and they're having a good life, and we're punishing the people, no? The people, common people, are the ones that are suffering the most, no? So with Obama's visit, with a lot of dollars coming in, a lot of people made investments, buying apartments, and these old vintage cars, 1930s and 40s and 50s. A lot of people got money lent in order to buy these cars. They cut off the roof to make them convertible. And now you can see it in the internet. It's a big luxury now to ride in those 1940s, 1950s Chevrolet or Ford, etc., and to go to visit the city. This old car without a roof looking up. And so many people, again, owe money because of that, no? There was a big hope of renovation of the economy. To answer your question, with Trump, President Donald Trump, he cut all that off completely. I mean, the embassies were never closed. I don't know if you heard about this so-called Havana syndrome, which by which some U.S. diplomats were affected by some sort of a mysterious sound. And not long ago, the American authorities recognized that Cuba didn't have absolutely anything to do with that. But Trump got that as a pretext to close well, not to close, but to reduce drastically the amount of American diplomats in Cuba. And therefore, the flights were cut, the remittances sent for Cuban families, excuse me, were cut. So that explains why we got this shift of a tremendous revival and renewal of our economy with the visit of Obama, and then with Trump administration. Now, when Obama came, Biden was the vice president. So there was a hope, no, that with Biden, there would be some sort of opening again. We have had a little bit of opening. Now, there are more flights. One of the things that Trump did was to limit the flights from the US to Cuba only to the Havana airport. Now Biden is opening that, so there are more flights to different international airports within the island. The Cuban families are allowed to send more remittances to the families in Cuba, more often and a higher quantity. But Obama still has, I mean, the main things that Trump did to choke us, Obama, Biden still has it in place. Some people say, perhaps it will happen the same thing with Obama, that it was in the second administration when Obama was reelected is when he did all these things for the benefit of the Cuban people, because he didn't have anything to lose with the Cuban Americans here that have a lot of lobbying influence. But many people say that Biden won't be reelected because he's too old or whatever. Internal American politics. But so that is the reason why we're hoping that whoever is elected president next year, American president, might help to open again the relationships with yes. Yeah, absolutely. The Cuban Americans, they have hijacked the relationships with Cuba. It's interesting because Cuba is treated by the different American administrations as a domestic issue, a domestic issue, because first of all, they don't recognize legitimacy of the Cuban government. And secondly, it is a big business really for them, for the Cuban Americans in Miami to keep the embargo in place, no? So they have a great influence and they have a lot of voting power, no? Yes. The logic, the logic of the argument. Yes, the logic is to tighten the sanctions for the situation to get so desperate that the Cuban people get up and revolt against the communist regime and take over and reestablish a so-called democratic government. That is the mindset of the embargo and of the sanctions, which is very, very, very unfair. And by the way, all the different UN General Assemblies in the last 20, 25 years, all the countries overwhelmingly vote against the embargo, and the US does not pay any attention to that. And it has been the oldest embargo that we have known, at least in recent history. But you say that it's easy to go to Cuba. I mean, as far as airlines is concerned, but a regular, it's very interesting. Many people do not know this. Many people talk about American freedom in the US. Well, you're not free to travel to Cuba as an American. If you want to go to Cuba now, you want to get an American Airlines flight to Cuba now, as a tourist, you're not allowed because of the embargo. Because basically you're not allowed to go because you're not allowed to spend your money in Cuba. So there are 12 exceptions to that, no? And one of the exception, their license. One of the exception is religious exchange. So that's why we receive so many groups from the Outreach Foundation, Living Waters for the World, our sister churches. They travel legally to Cuba, by the way, carrying thousands of dollars in cash, because the other problem is that you cannot transfer dollars to Cuba because of the sanctions. But with a license saying that you are visiting the churches in Cuba, then you can legally travel to Cuba. But if you do not comply, you are submitted to big, heavy fines. So some Americans go, but yes, of course. No. The fines come from the Treasury Department. But some Americans go as tourists also hidden through third countries. The Cuban immigration tries not to stamp the passport, so there's no evidence that you have been to Cuba. But it's easy. I have to admit that it's relatively easy to get one of these licenses, no, through the church, but also for journalists, scientific research, etc. Mark. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the commercial. Now, talking about fines, many people do not know that the embargo not only affects our bilateral trade between Cuba and the US, it has an extraterritorial character. That means that banks, for example, in Switzerland, that have actions in American banks are not allowed to transfer money to Cuba. I'm going to give you an example. When I served as staff in the World Council of Churches in Geneva, my father asked me, listen to this, to order a book in India to be shipped to Cuba for him. So I was in the UBS bank, the biggest bank in Switzerland. We had our bank account. So I made a transfer of money to India to purchase the book. And I made the mistake in the observations box. I put purchase a book for Cuba. Every time you write the word Cuba in any form, you're going to get into trouble. So the weeks passed and the Indians never got the transfer. The Swiss bank never said anything to me either. And when I went to inquire, they said, no, we didn't transfer that money because you're not allowed to send money to Cuba. And I said, wait a minute. I am not sending money to Cuba. I'm sending money to India to purchase a book for Cuba. And anyway, if I'm going to transfer money to Cuba, it's my own money. For heaven's sake, you're the biggest bank, one of the biggest banks in the world, and you say you're a neutral country, and you do not allow me to do what I want with my money? And we left. We left to another bank. No, it's a shame. But why is it? Because thousands of dollars of fine for not complying with the American law. Another interesting detail, Cuba is in the list of countries that sponsor terrorism. We are not a terrorist country, by all means, not a terrorist country. But because of that, since we are supporting terrorism, that's one of the reasons why we cannot transfer money to Cuba, because we are not supposed to support. And it is another excuse precisely for having these sanctions, which is a big lie, big lie. Yes. Yes. I mean, we have several we have our national currency, and we have bank accounts of hard currencies in dollars or in euros. Yes. That both personally and also the churches and the seminary as well. Sorry? Well, we have a president, vice president. We have a prime minister. We have the parliament, which was recently elected with young people. I was telling Mark that we have a lot of hope with that because we have very smart young people. Those few young people did not leave the country. So it's basically our government. We have only one party, one political party officially registered, which is a problem, no? Yes, we vote, but in the constraints of only one party. I mean, opposition is, we have very small opposition in Cuba, and it's illegal. It is illegal. And one of the things that I have learned in all these countries when I travel, when I lived in Switzerland, etc., is that governments need legal opposition to help hold them accountable. So that's one of the issues that we need to continue working on in our country.
Okay, we get involved in any of these ministries, but extensive things that you find interesting. Just send a fair amount of money for pastoral support. You can imagine what it's like to be in that environment, and being able to pastor of your church, people are suffering as much and not being able to contribute, for instance, to the funding of the church. So we do a lot of that type of support. We support Honda, obviously, the seminary, their education for students. That is, I think we helped contribute to their online programming. That's kind of the way throughout the world.
Yes.
Online.
As a result of the pandemic, mainly.
Even churches going through a period of time, they're also trying to find ways to generate income. So we will frequently see in Cuban churches, the artists that do their work that sell their work at the church. Church gets a portion of that, it's a way of generating income. They're just trying to work in so many ways. So anyway, you want to get engaged. We feel like education, vulnerable women and children, pastoral training, support for pastors. It's pretty expensive. We have a very good list. Any other further questions, comments?
Yes, we're very proud of that. I mean, 1960, the Presbytery of Cuba, the Presbyterian Church, was part of the Synod of New Jersey. Until 1966, we got the independence. And in 1967, we organized our own national church with our national leadership. It's called the Presbyterian Reformed Church in Cuba. And one of the very first things that we did in that General Assembly of constituting the new indigenous or national church was to ordain the first women. And ever since, we have been ordaining women. Of course, in our Presbyterian church, which is like yours, quite liberal, no? One of the struggles that we have with other nations a bit more conservative is that women can study theology in our seminary, but some of their churches do not ordain them, precisely because they're women. No?
They do. They're probably 50 years ahead of you.
Absolutely.
Now,
absolutely. Yes.
Okay. That's lesson.
Thank you, and thank you. Thank you for your interest, for your prayers, and support.
If you want to shake the hand of the Cuban pastor before you leave, great. But I got a whiskey mom.